On the morning of April 8, 2026, the same morning that the world was celebrating a ceasefire between the United States and Iran, the Israeli Air Force launched what it described as its largest single wave of strikes on Beirut since the beginning of the war. 100 targets, 10 minutes, more than 250 people killed, over 1,100 wounded in a single morning. Lebanon declared a national day of mourning, and here is the detail that I want you to sit with before we go any further. This happened at 6 a.m. Beirut time. The ceasefire had been in effect for less than 12 hours. Iran's parliament speaker immediately counted it as violation number 1 of Iran's 10-point proposal. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz again. The ceasefire that markets had just celebrated with a 1,300-point Dow surge was, functionally, already broken. And what did the United States do? Vice President Vance, who was traveling in Hungary at the time, said the following, and I am quoting him directly: "Ceasefires are always messy." That was the response. Ceasefires are always messy. If you want to understand the real power structure of this conflict, not the announced structure, not the diplomatic language, not the official narrative, you need to understand what that non-response reveals. Because the United States did not condemn the strikes. It did not demand Israel stop. It did not issue a warning. It offered a shrug and a truism. What that tells you is not a small thing. What that tells you is that the most powerful country in the world cannot, or will not, stop the military operations of a nation it has called its closest ally for 75 years. And that single fact changes the entire geometry of the ceasefire, the Islamabad talks, and everything that comes after them. Let me give you the exact facts because precision matters here. The ceasefire was brokered by Pakistan. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif said explicitly, publicly, on the record, that the agreement included a halt to Israeli attacks on Lebanon. That was his understanding of what had been agreed. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said the opposite. The ceasefire with Iran, he said, does not include Lebanon. Israel would continue its military operations against Hezbollah. Lebanon was not part of the deal. Pakistani Prime Minister Sharif responded by calling out the violations and urging all parties to exercise restraint and respect the ceasefire for 2 weeks. Australia's Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said Lebanon must be included. France said the same. The Lebanese president said there could be no negotiations under fire. So we have a situation where the mediator of the ceasefire says Lebanon is included. The targeted country says Lebanon must be included. International observers say Lebanon must be included. And the country conducting the strikes says Lebanon is not included and continues striking. This is not a misunderstanding. This is a deliberate unilateral action by Israel to maintain military operations during a ceasefire it formally endorsed while carving out an exception it never disclosed to the mediator who brokered it. In diplomatic terms, this is called bad faith. In strategic terms, it is something more specific and more consequential. This is where the game theory becomes essential. Let me introduce a concept that explains exactly what Israel is doing and why it is so structurally dangerous. The concept is called spoiler dynamics. In conflict resolution theory, a spoiler is an actor who has the incentive and the capability to derail a peace process, because their interests are better served by continued conflict than by settlement. Spoilers are not irrational. They are actors who have made a rational calculation that they lose more from peace than from war. What are Israel's interests in this conflict? Hezbollah, which operates in Lebanon with Iranian support, has been Israel's primary security concern for decades. A U.S.-Iran deal that includes any form of ceasefire in Lebanon and security guarantees for Hezbollah's continued existence leaves Israel facing the same threat it had before the war began. But with Iran now having demonstrated that it can sustain a direct conflict with America, close the Strait of Hormuz, and negotiate from a position of strength. For Israel, the worst possible outcome of this war is a U.S.-Iran settlement that leaves Hezbollah intact, Iran's regional influence expanded, and American military presence in the Gulf reduced. And that is precisely the trajectory the Islamabad talks are heading toward. So from Israel's strategic perspective, the rational move is exactly what it is doing. Maintain military pressure on Lebanon, force Iran to keep counting violations, keep the ceasefire unstable, and make it as difficult as possible for Washington and Tehran to reach a durable agreement that leaves Israel's security position worse than where it started. This is not recklessness. This is a calculated spoiler strategy, and it is working. History tells us this pattern has appeared before, and the precedent is sobering. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter brokered the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt, one of the most significant diplomatic achievements in American history. Egypt became the first Arab state to formally recognize Israel, and in exchange, Israel agreed to withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula. But during the Camp David process, there was a second track: negotiations over Palestinian autonomy in the West Bank and Gaza. Israel signed the framework, and then, systematically, Israel expanded settlements in the West Bank in a way that made the Palestinian autonomy framework functionally impossible to implement. Carter was furious. He called it a betrayal of the spirit of Camp David. But what could he do? Cut off military aid to Israel during the Cold War? Withdraw American security guarantees? The political cost was too high. So the Palestinian track died. The settlements expanded. And 40 years later, the consequences of that dynamic are still playing out. The structural parallel to 2026 is not perfect. No historical parallel is. But the core dynamic is the same. Israel is taking actions that it knows will derail a diplomatic process that its patron, the United States, is trying to construct. And the United States is discovering, again, that its ability to constrain Israeli military operations is far more limited than its public posture suggests. Now let me go to the deeper layer. The thing that the ceasefire coverage is not discussing. There is a question that follows directly from Israel's behavior in the last 48 hours, and it is the question that should be at the center of every analysis of this crisis. If the United States cannot stop Israel from bombing Beirut during a ceasefire it brokered, what does that tell us about the actual structure of the U.S.-Israel relationship? The official story is simple. Israel is America's closest ally, the Middle East's only democracy, a strategic partner of 75 years standing. America provides approximately $3.8 billion in military aid to Israel annually. America vetoes UN resolutions critical of Israeli military operations. American carrier groups deploy to the eastern Mediterranean when Israel faces threats. But here is the structural reality that emerges from the last 48 hours. America announced a ceasefire. Israel violated it. America's response was, ceasefires are always messy. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz. Global oil prices spiked. Markets that had just surged on ceasefire optimism pulled back. The cost of Israel's decision to continue its Lebanon operations is being paid by the United States, in economic terms, in diplomatic terms, in the credibility of the ceasefire it brokered, and in the leverage it brings to the Islamabad negotiations. America is paying Israel's strategic bill, and America cannot make Israel stop running up the tab. This is not an ally relationship. In a genuine ally relationship, the more powerful party has the ability, if not always the willingness, to restrain the less powerful party when that party's actions damage the shared strategic position. What we are watching in real time is a situation where the United States has neither the willingness nor, apparently, the effective capability to restrain Israeli military operations, even when those operations are directly undermining America's most urgent diplomatic priority. Think about what this means for the Islamabad talks. Iran's first condition for a durable settlement is a halt to attacks on Lebanon. The United States cannot deliver that condition. It cannot deliver it because Israel has unilaterally declared Lebanon outside the scope of any agreement, and America has accepted this unilateral declaration with nothing more forceful than the observation that ceasefires are always messy. So America arrives in Islamabad unable to deliver Iran's first and most fundamental condition. What does that do to American negotiating credibility? What does it do to Pakistan's credibility as a mediator? What does it do to every subsequent commitment America makes at the table? The answer is that it makes every American commitment contingent on Israeli compliance. And Israeli compliance is something America has just demonstrated it cannot guarantee. Let me now address the question that makes this analysis complete. Why can't America stop Israel? Or more precisely, why won't it? The honest answer combines domestic politics with structural dependency in a way that has no clean resolution. Domestically, the political cost of being seen as abandoning or pressuring Israel, even when Israel is actively undermining American diplomatic efforts, is calculated by every administration as too high to pay. The domestic political infrastructure around U.S.-Israel relations has been built over 75 years and is deeply embedded in both parties. This is not a conspiracy. It is a structural reality of American political economy. Strategically, the United States has outsourced significant elements of its regional intelligence, military logistics, and force protection infrastructure to Israeli capabilities. Publicly confronting Israel means potentially losing access to cooperation that American military planners genuinely depend on. And diplomatically, any American pressure on Israel becomes a narrative that adversaries, Iran, Russia, China, use to argue that the Western alliance is fracturing, which makes the pressure harder to apply even when the strategic logic demands it. The result is a trap. America needs Israel to stop bombing Lebanon to save the ceasefire. America cannot make Israel stop bombing Lebanon. The ceasefire is therefore hostage to an actor that the United States cannot control and will not confront. That is the structural impasse underneath the headlines. Here is the synthesis. Israel is not irrational. It is pursuing a coherent spoiler strategy designed to prevent a U.S.-Iran settlement that leaves Hezbollah intact and Iran's regional influence expanded. That strategy is working. The ceasefire is under maximum stress. The Islamabad talks begin today with America unable to deliver Iran's first condition. The United States faces a choice it has been avoiding for 75 years. Either it develops the willingness and the mechanism to constrain Israeli military operations when those operations damage American strategic interests, or it accepts that its diplomatic efforts in the Middle East will always be held hostage to an ally it cannot control. Rome faced this problem with its most powerful client kingdoms. Britain faced it with its settler colonies. Empires always discover, eventually, that their most capable proxies become the hardest to manage, because capability creates independence, and independence creates the freedom to pursue interests that diverge from the patrons. The deeper question of Islamabad is not what Iran and America agree to. It is whether America can deliver on what it agrees to, given that the most significant obstacle to any durable settlement is not in Tehran. It is in Jerusalem. This is not prophecy. This is structural analysis applied to the facts that are in front of us today on the morning of April 10, 2026. Look at the timeline. Look at the strike orders. Look at Vance's non-response. Look at what Iran is counting. The ceasefire is fragile because America has a spoiler it cannot stop. And until that structural problem is addressed, every agreement signed in Islamabad will face the same morning it has already lived through once.